The morning Hester Chandler sold her last pie to a stranger who refused to tell her the price was too high, she decided that grief had made her either brave or foolish, and standing in the thin October dust of the Millhaven depot platform in 1882, she could not quite determine which. She had been widowed 14 months prior, when Thomas Chandler rode out to check the eastern fence line of the small homestead they had built together on the edge of Colfax County, New Mexico Territory, and never came back. The horse returned without him 2 days later, lathered and wild-eyed, and the men who went looking found Thomas at the base of a rocky draw, thrown and broken, his neck snapped clean by the fall. There had been no violence, no foul play, only the terrible ordinary cruelty of the land claiming a man who had loved it too much to be careful. Hester was 26 years old, childless, and left with a quarter section of dry grass, a leaking roof, and $43 in a tin box beneath the kitchen floorboards. She had done the arithmetic carefully, the way Thomas had taught her, sitting at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and the back of an old flour sack. The $43 would not last the winter. The homestead was too small and too dry to farm profitably alone, and the nearest cattle operation that might hire her for domestic work was 3 days' ride, which she could not manage because she had sold the second horse to pay the doctor who had ridden out to confirm what she already knew. What she had was a cast-iron stove, her grandmother's recipe for apple and dried cherry pie, and a determination that felt less like courage and more like the absence of any remaining alternative. The depot at Millhaven was the center of everything in that part of the territory. The Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway had laid track through the valley 2 years prior, and the little town had swelled accordingly, drawing cattle buyers from Kansas City, drummers hawking patent medicines and bolts of cotton, land speculators with soft hands and hard eyes, and cowboys in from the ranches to ship cattle or collect wire and supplies. Every Thursday and Saturday, the platform was crowded from 7 in the morning until the last eastbound train cleared the yard at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Hester had observed. During the 3 months she spent watching and calculating before she committed herself, that the men moving through that crowd were nearly always hungry and almost never in any condition to wait for a proper meal. She had spoken to the station master, a broad-shouldered Czech named Ondrej Havel, whose wife had given birth to twin boys the prior spring, and who therefore possessed a bone-deep sympathy for any woman trying to hold her world together by the force of her own 2 hands. He had agreed to let her use the eastern corner of the platform, beneath the narrow overhang of the freight office roof, in exchange for 2 pies per week set aside for his family. It was a generous arrangement, and Hester knew it, and she honored it faithfully. By the 2nd month she was baking from 4 in the morning until 6, loading the pies carefully into the 2 flat wooden crates Thomas had built for hauling vegetables, and driving the mule cart the 4 miles into town in the gray pre-dawn air. She charged 15 cents for a full slice, wrapped in brown paper, and 25 cents for a quarter pie if a man wanted to take something with him on the train. She made apple pie with dried fruit she reconstituted overnight in a crock of water sweetened with a spoonful of sorghum. She made sweet potato pie with nutmeg she kept in a small glass jar and treated like gold dust. She made dried cherry, and she made a chess pie that was nothing more than butter and sugar and eggs from her 4 surviving hens. But men ate it and closed their eyes when they did, and that was the highest compliment available on a depot platform in the territory. On the 3rd Saturday of October, she arrived at the platform a little before 7 with 16 pies in her crates, her dark hair pinned under a calico bonnet that was beginning to fray at the brim, and her good wool coat buttoned to the throat against the sharp morning cold that rolled down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains like a wave breaking on shore. She set up her table, which was actually the lid of a shipping crate balanced across 2 sawhorses that Ondrej had loaned her indefinitely, spread her clean white cloth, and began arranging the pies with the careful precision of a woman who understood that presentation was a form of dignity. The first train came in at 7:42, 40 minutes late and hissing steam and indignation, and the crowd that surged off the cars and out of the waiting room was thick and immediately hungry. Hester worked steadily, cutting slices, making change from the small tin box she kept in her apron pocket, talking pleasantly but briefly to the men who stopped. She had learned to read the crowd the way a sailor reads weather. The land speculators paid and moved on quickly. The cowboys lingered, leaning against the freight office wall and eating slowly, reluctant to return to whatever work was waiting. The drummers tried to barter goods for pie, and Hester declined politely every time because she needed coins, not ribbon or liniment. By 9 o'clock she had sold 11 pies and was feeling the particular warm satisfaction of a morning going well when she noticed the man standing at the far end of the platform. He was not remarkable in the way that immediately arrested attention. He was tall, but not unusually so. He wore a good coat, brown wool, well brushed, over a plain work shirt with no collar pin. His hat was a well-shaped black felt with a modest brim, pushed back slightly on his head in a way that suggested he wore it from habit rather than performance. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with a weathered quality to his face that spoke of years outdoors, a jaw that carried a week's worth of dark stubble, and eyes that Hester, from 20 feet away, could not precisely determine the color of but which appeared to be watching her with a quality of attention she was not accustomed to receiving from strangers at this platform. He was speaking with 2 other men, both of whom she recognized as riders from the big ranches north of town, men who shipped cattle through Millhaven regularly and who bought apple pie from her with the solemn gratitude of men too long deprived of anything sweet. But he was not looking at them. He was watching her table, or possibly her, and there was nothing predatory in his attention, only something focused and considering, the look of a man working through a careful calculation. Hester served 2 more customers and did not look back at him again, because she had also learned that acknowledging excessive attention from strangers was not always wise, even in a busy public place. But then he walked over. He was polite about it, removing his hat when he reached her table and holding it at his side, which she noted immediately because most men did not bother. He looked at her remaining pies, 5 whole ones and the remnants of several others that she was selling by the slice, and then he looked at her, and she could see now that his eyes were a dark shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and that they were reading her with the same steadiness with which she had already been reading him. "Good morning," he said. His voice was level and unhurried, a voice accustomed to large open spaces where there was no need to compete with other noise. "Good morning," she replied, with the practiced pleasantness she kept ready for all customers. "Slice or quarter?" He looked at the pies again. "How many have you got left all told?" she counted. 5 whole and parts of 3 others. Call it 7 full pies worth, roughly. He nodded once slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "I'll take them," he said. Hester was certain she had misheard him. The platform was loud always, with the sound of the second train approaching from the west and the general noise of commerce and livestock and men. "I beg your pardon, all of them," he said. "Whatever you have left, I'll buy the lot." She stared at him for a moment, which was not something she typically allowed herself to do with customers. "Sir, that would come to," she calculated quickly, the way she always did, without appearing to, that would come to somewhere between $4 and $5, depending on how I count the partial pies. "Call it $5 even," he said, "and add in whatever's fair for the trouble of wrapping them." He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a small leather fold, and from it extracted a $5 bill, crisp and clean, and laid it on her table with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had considered his actions before taking them. Hester looked at the bill and then looked at him. $5 was more than she typically earned on a full Saturday, and it was not even 10 o'clock. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "It's fair," he said. "I've got 8 ranch hands who haven't had a proper piece of pie since August, and the cook at the Finley spread has a broken wrist and can't be expected to bake for another month. They'll be grateful." She began wrapping the pies in the brown paper she kept in a roll beneath the table, tying each one with a length of string. She worked methodically, as she did everything, and in the silence that settled between them while she worked, she was acutely aware that he had not moved away, as most buyers did once the transaction was concluded. He remained standing at her table, hat in hand, watching her work with that same quality of focused attention. "You'll need something to carry these in," she said. "I can lend you my crates if you'll have them returned by next Thursday." "I'll return them Thursday," he agreed readily. She finished wrapping the last pie and began loading the crates with care. He leaned forward to help, shifting the crates to an easier angle without being asked, and she noticed his hands, broad and scarred in the way of all men who worked with rope and wire and livestock, but careful with the pies as though he understood they represented something that mattered. When the crates were loaded and the transaction was truly complete, he straightened and looked at her again and said, "I don't believe I know your name." It was such a simple thing to say. Men at the platform had spoken with her for months, had bought her pies and eaten them leaning against the freight office wall and ridden away, and not one of them had asked her name. They called her ma'am, and that had seemed sufficient to everyone, including she had thought herself. "Hester," she said, and then, because he was waiting, "Hester Chandler." He nodded as though he were placing the name carefully somewhere reliable in his memory. "David Finley," he said. "I run cattle north of here, out toward the San Antonio River." "I know the country a little," she said. "My husband and I had a homestead east of Millhaven." She said it plainly because it was plain fact, but she watched him register the past tense and the word husband together, and understand what they meant without requiring her to explain it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and he said it without the stilted awkwardness that such words usually carried from strangers, said it the way a person who had experienced loss themselves said it, with a brevity that honored the weight of it rather than trying to dress it up. "Thank you," she said. He picked up the crates, one balanced in each hand with practiced ease, and then paused. "Do you come every Thursday and Saturday?" "Every Thursday and Saturday," she confirmed. He nodded once more. "Then I expect I'll see you Thursday," he said, and walked away through the thinning crowd toward the end of the platform, where a wagon and a pair of good bay horses were hitched to the rail, where the 2 men she had seen him speaking with earlier were waiting to load supplies. Hester stood at her empty table with the $5 bill folded in her apron pocket and watched him go, and felt something she had not felt in 14 months, something small and unsteady, like a flame catching in the draft from an opening door. She did not name it. She was too practical for that, but she did not dismiss it either. The drive back to the homestead that afternoon was 4 miles of rut and scrub brush under a pale autumn sky, and she spent all 4 miles thinking about the particular quality of his voice when he had said he expected he would see her Thursday, and the way he had remembered to ask her name only after the transaction was complete, as though the pies had been the reason for approaching, but the name had been the actual question. Thursday came in cold and overcast, with the smell of distance in the wind. Hester baked through the night, as she always did, sleeping 2 hours on the kitchen settle before rising to check the stove, and arrived at the platform in the dark with 14 pies and a determination that had nothing to do with David Finley and everything to do with the rent due on the quarter section at the end of November. This is what she told herself, in any case. He arrived at 8:10, on horseback this time rather than by wagon, with one of his riders trailing behind him on a gray roan, and he carried her 2 crates strapped across the back of the second horse, returned exactly as he had promised, which she noted with the precision with which she noted everything that affected her livelihood. He tied up at the rail and walked to her table and handed her back the crates, and she thanked him, and he bought 3 pies, not the entire supply this time, only 3, and paid fairly and said nothing beyond what was necessary for the transaction, but he also did not leave. He stood at the end of her table with a piece of chess pie wrapped in brown paper and ate it slowly, watching the train yard, and after a time he said, without particular preamble, "My foreman tells me the big homesteads east of town mostly turned over this past year. Hard conditions." "They did," she said. She was serving another customer and did not look at him. "The summer was dry. Were you thinking of selling your quarter section?" The question was direct and without apparent ulterior motive. The question of a man who was accustomed to land transactions and asked about them the way others might ask about the weather. She finished making change for the customer and turned to face David fully. "I have thought about it," she said honestly. "It's not producing enough for one person to carry." He nodded. "Land north of the river's worth more now the railway's in. East of town has improved too since they put in the road to Socorro. You might get a better price than you think." "Are you asking because you're interested in buying?" she said, because she was practical above all things and could not afford to be otherwise. Something shifted in his expression, not exactly amusement but adjacent to it, the look of a man who appreciated directness and was slightly surprised to encounter it. "Not specifically," he said, "but I know several buyers who are. I could put you in contact with them if that's useful." "That might be useful," she said carefully, "though I want to be sure the transaction was legitimate." "I can vouch for the men I'd introduce you to," he said. "I wouldn't offer otherwise." She believed him, which surprised her slightly, because she had learned in the months since Thomas died to be careful about believing men she did not know. But David Finley's word had the quality of a thing said once and meant completely, and she had always trusted her instincts about people, even when she occasionally wished she didn't. "Then I'd be grateful," she said. "But I'd need to think carefully about timing. If I sell, I'll need somewhere to go." "There's boarding rooms in town," he said, still in that same level tone. "Mrs. Abernathy on Cedar Street takes in respectable ladies. The rate is reasonable." He said it matter-of-factly, as though he had simply thought it through before speaking, which she suspected he had. David Finley seemed like a man who thought before speaking as a general practice rather than an occasional discipline. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He finished his pie and folded the paper neatly and tucked it in his coat pocket, rather than dropping it on the platform, which she noticed. And then he tipped his hat and said he'd be back Saturday, and rode away. On Saturday he came again, and bought 2 pies, and stood at the end of her table long enough to tell her that Elias Boone, a land buyer out of Santa Fe, would be in Millhaven the following week and might be worth speaking to about the quarter section. He mentioned it as a side note to a conversation that had begun with the merits of chess pie versus sweet potato, which she had raised herself, and the transition from pie to land business was so natural that she had answered him 3 sentences before she registered that they were discussing her future. She sold the quarter section to Elias Boone on the 4th of November, 1882, for $230, which was more than she had expected and less than she had hoped, but was sufficient for her to take a room at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house on Cedar Street, continue her baking business, and have a margin of safety for the first time since Thomas had ridden out to the east fence line and not come back. The night before the transaction closed, she sat at the small deal table in what was still, technically, her kitchen, and wrote down the numbers for the last time. She had been doing this for 14 months, this careful accounting, and it had saved her. But it had also kept her company in the way that necessary tasks sometimes do, filling the silent hours so that grief could not occupy all of them. She was not certain what she would do with the evenings when the accounting no longer concerned survival. It was a question she had not yet answered. David did not take credit for the land sale, did not present it as a favor or reference it again. He appeared at the platform the following Thursday and bought his pies and said nothing about Boone or the transaction, and when she told him herself, straightforwardly, that it had gone well and she was grateful for the introduction, he only nodded and said he was glad of it, and moved on to asking about the sweet potato pie, which he had not tried yet. "You've bought pies from me for 3 weeks, and you haven't tried the sweet potato." she said, and heard in her own voice something that was very nearly teasing, a tone she had not used with anyone in more than a year. He looked at her with the ghost of that expression she had started to recognize, the near amusement that lived at the corner of his mouth. "I've been working through the selection in order," he said. "That is a very orderly approach," she said. "I find it pays to be thorough," he said, and she handed him a slice of sweet potato pie wrapped in brown paper, and he ate it standing at the end of her table. And after the first bite, he was quiet for a long moment in a way that she understood meant the pie had done what good pie should do. "My mother made sweet potato pie," he said eventually in a different quality of voice. "Where was that?" she asked. "Tennessee," he said. "I came out here when I was 19. She passed the year after." "I'm sorry," she said, and she said it exactly the way he had said it to her, brief and honest, and she saw him register that. He looked at her directly then, not with the calculating assessment of that first Saturday, but with something more open. "Did you grow up here?" he asked. "Ohio," she said. "I came out with Thomas when we married. He wanted land. We both did, I suppose. There was something appealing about the idea of it being ours." She paused. "It turned out to be true about the appeal. I still sometimes think the land was the best thing we made together, even though it's not mine anymore." "What will you do now?" he asked. "Keep baking," she said without hesitation. "I'm good at it and people want it, and I can do it from town just as well as from the homestead. Better, actually, because Mrs. Abernathy's kitchen stove is newer than mine was." "Have you ever thought of opening a proper bakery?" he said. She had. She had thought about it the way she thought about many things, carefully, and in the small hours of the morning when the stove needed checking. "The capital investment is too large right now," she said. "It doesn't have to be large to start," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Are you a man who gives a great deal of business advice to women he meets at depot platforms?" He smiled then, a full smile, the first one she had seen from him, and it changed his face in a way that did something considerable to the air in the immediate vicinity. "Only to ones who bake as well as you do," he said. "The territory would be improved by a proper pie shop." "The territory," she said, "would be improved by a great many things." "That's true," he allowed. He left shortly after, swinging up onto his horse with the ease of a man who had been doing it since childhood, and rode north toward the river. And Hester watched the platform crowd move in and fill the space he had vacated and thought about what it meant that she had just had a conversation about her future with a man she had known for 3 weeks and had found it entirely comfortable. November deepened and sharpened, and the cottonwoods along the Millhaven Creek went from yellow to bare, and the mornings came in harder and colder, and Hester's pies sold as well in the cold as they had in the warmth, perhaps better, because cold weather sharpened the body's desire for sweetness and warmth and the specific comfort of crust and filling. She was settled at Mrs. Abernathy's now, in a room on the second floor that looked east toward the mountains, which she could see in clear weather as a blue-gray line against the sky, and which she found deeply reassuring in ways she could not entirely articulate. Ellen Abernathy was a widow herself, 52 years old, with sharp dark eyes and an opinion on every subject she had ever encountered, and she had taken to Hester with an efficiency that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this kind of young woman to fill her best upstairs room. She fed Hester breakfast every morning and asked nothing in return beyond the reasonable monthly rate and what she called the pleasure of sensible company, by which she meant a person who did not gossip about her neighbors and did not require emotional management. David Finley came to the platform every Thursday and most Saturdays, and bought pies for his ranch hands and occasionally for himself, and the conversations at the end of her table grew incrementally longer each time, pushing from transaction into something that was unmistakably conversation between people developing a regard for each other. He told her about the ranch, which he had bought 8 years prior from an older cattleman who had decided he was too old for New Mexico territory and wanted to retire to his daughter's home in St. Louis. He had built it from 300 head to over 1,000, with grazing land along both sides of the San Antonio River, and a set of good stone buildings that he had put up himself over the first 2 years, working alongside his hands. She told him about Ohio, about the farm her parents had kept, about the church where she had met Thomas at 17 and married him at 18, about the journey west by train and then wagon, about the first sight of the mountains, which had struck her with a force she had not expected and had not diminished in the years since. She told him about learning to bake the way her grandmother had taught her, the way all the important knowledge in her life had been transmitted, quietly and practically and without ceremony, and about realizing after Thomas's death that this was the thing she had that was entirely her own, knowledge no bad luck could take from her. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, unhurried and complete, as though what she was saying was worth the full weight of his concentration, and she found herself talking more freely than she had talked to anyone since Thomas, more freely than she had talked to Ellen Abernathy even, with whom she was genuinely friendly. There was something about David Finley's silences that made speech feel safe. The Millhaven Christmas social was held the second Saturday of December in the meeting hall above the general store. A large, low-ceilinged room decorated with pine boughs and hung with paper lanterns that cast an amber light over the crowd of ranchers and merchants and homesteaders and railroad men who constituted the town's social fabric. Hester went because Ellen Abernathy went, and Ellen considered it a civic duty equivalent to voting, and Hester had discovered it was not wise to resist Ellen Abernathy's civic convictions. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool, simply cut, and which she had let out at the waist slightly because the months of better regular meals at Ellen's table had restored the weight she had lost in the first black winter of her widowhood. She pinned her dark hair up more carefully than usual and wore the small garnet earrings that had been her mother's, and she thought she looked respectable, if not precisely festive. David Finley was there, which she had not specifically anticipated, though when she thought about it she supposed she should have. He was standing near the punch bowl with his foreman, a quiet Mexican man named Aurelio Vega, who Hester had met briefly at the platform once when he had come in for supplies while David collected the week's pies. David was wearing a dark jacket that she had not seen before, clean-shaved for the occasion, and when he turned and saw her across the crowded room, the expression on his face went through several rapid changes, none of which she could fully read, before settling into the composed attention that was his characteristic expression. He crossed the room to speak with her, and the punch bowl crowd parted naturally around him in the way it did for men of his physical self-possession, and he said good evening to her and good evening to Ellen Abernathy, to whom he was clearly known, and Ellen shook his hand with the decisive manner of a woman who had already formed an opinion. She was not revising. "Your pies are spoken of very highly at the Finley Ranch," Ellen told Hester afterward, having detached herself briefly to speak with the minister's wife. "Very highly indeed. He's a loyal customer," Hester said. "He is also," Ellen said, with the precision of a woman who had been observing human behavior for 52 years, "a man who rides 4 miles into town on a Thursday morning for a piece of pie when any sensible cattle operation buys its supplies on a single weekly run." Hester did not answer this. "I am simply making an observation," Ellen said, and went to speak with the minister's wife. The dancing began at 8 o'clock, with a fiddle and a guitar and a man from the eastern ranches, who played a mouth organ with startling enthusiasm. The floor was crowded, and the light was warm, and the pine boughs gave the room a sharp living fragrance that cut through the wool and tobacco and wood smoke, and Hester stood with a cup of punch at the edge of the floor and watched the dancing with the particular bittersweet quality of a person who had once danced and was not yet sure whether she was allowed to again. David appeared at her left elbow at 8:30. He had the slightly formal manner of a man about to say something he had considered. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. She looked at the floor, where several couples were moving through a reel with varying degrees of competence and enthusiasm, and then she looked at him, and she thought about Thomas, which she did honestly and without flinching, and she thought about the flame she had felt catching on that first October morning and had been careful not to name, and she said, "Yes." He danced well, which surprised her, though she thought afterward that she should not have been surprised by anything he did well, as he seemed to bring the same thoroughness to everything. He held her the proper distance and moved with a certainty that made it easy to follow, and they talked while they danced, which was easier than standing still and talking because the movement gave her eyes somewhere to go other than directly at him. "You're from Ohio," he said. "I told you that weeks ago," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it. Were you ever sorry you came west?" The question was serious and deserved a serious answer. "No," she said after a moment. "Not even after. The land got him, but I don't hold it against the land. It's what he wanted, what we both wanted. It would be wrong to become bitter about the place that gave us what we'd asked for just because it also took it back." His hand at her waist tightened very slightly, a fraction of an inch, almost imperceptible. "That's a remarkable way to think about it," he said. "It's the only way I could manage," she said honestly. The reel ended, and a slower piece began, and they stayed on the floor, and she was aware of Ellen Abernathy's gaze from across the room with the peripheral precision of a woman who had learned not to appear to be looking where she was looking. "My wife died 4 years ago," David said, in a low voice that had nothing to do with the music and everything to do with the conversation they had been having in pieces over the preceding weeks. The conversation that had been working its way toward this admission the way a creek works toward the open ground. "Fever. We'd been married 2 years. He paused. She was a good woman. She deserved more time." Hester said nothing for a moment, only danced, because sometimes silence was the more honest acknowledgement. Then she said, "I'm very sorry. I'm telling you because," he stopped again, which was unusual for him. "I'm telling you because I think you should know, given that I've been coming to your table every week for 6 weeks and buying more pie than any ranch crew genuinely requires." The honesty of it made her breath unsteady for just a moment, a tremor she controlled by meeting it directly. "I had noticed the quantity," she said. "I thought you had," he said. His voice was careful, not pressuring, only honest. "I'm not asking anything of you, Hester. I understand that 14 months is recent. I just didn't want to go on the way we've been going without you knowing why I come." She considered this for the length of 3 slow bars of music. "I know why you come," she said quietly. "I've known for several weeks. I've been coming to the same conclusion." He looked at her then, directly, with the full force of those gray-green eyes, and she looked back at him with the full force of her own, and something passed between them that required no further translation. They danced 2 more dances, and then he walked her back to Ellen's table and took his leave with appropriate decorum, and Ellen said nothing at all, which was the loudest thing Ellen Abernathy had ever communicated. December moved forward with increasing cold and the quality of anticipation that the weeks before Christmas carry in even the most subdued of hearts. David rode into town on Tuesdays now as well as Thursdays and Saturdays, appearing at the depot platform on the excuse of collecting mail or conferring with his solicitor or conducting some piece of ranch business that had apparently become suddenly urgent. And they talked, and the conversations were no longer short, and they no longer pretended to be primarily about pie. He told her about the ranch in detail now, the way a person describes something they love, the stone buildings and the river bends, and the particular quality of light in winter when the snow on the sangers turned the whole sky pink at sunset. He told her about Aurelio Vega, who had come with the land and who was the closest thing David had to a friend in the territory, a man of quiet competence and absolute loyalty, who had been running cattle in New Mexico longer than David had been alive. He told her about the 8 ranch hands, their names and characters and individual eccentricities, with a dry affection that told her He was the kind of employer who paid attention to the people who worked for him. She told him about her plans for the bakery, which had become more concrete now that the money from the land sale gave her a genuine starting point. She had been speaking with a merchant named Calvert who owned a small building on Main Street that had been a tobacco shop and was currently empty, and the rent was within reach if the business performed the way she thought it would. She told David about this, and he listened carefully and asked practical questions, the kind a person with business experience asks, about supply and pricing, and whether the existing oven in the building was adequate, and she realized that he was not advising her so much as thinking alongside her, which was a different thing and preferable. "You'd want to keep the platform table," he said one Tuesday morning as the December wind came off the mountains sharp and cold, and they stood close together at the end of her table because the cold made the distance that decorum required less practical than usual. "The depot traffic is reliable, but a fixed location would let you expand the selection. I've been thinking about bread," she said. "Real bread, not just the sweet things. The town has no baker." "The town has no baker," he confirmed. "Andred's wife makes her own and half the women on Cedar Street make their own, but the cowboys and the bachelors buy what the general store stocks, which comes in on the train and is generally unfortunate." "You speak from experience," she said. "Extensive and regrettable experience," he said. She laughed, a full, genuine laugh, and he looked at her with a quality of pleasure that was entirely undisguised, the look of a man who has heard something he wanted to hear. Christmas Eve arrived with a proper snow, the first of the season, 2 inches of clean white that settled on the plaza and the depot yard and the bare cottonwoods along the creek and made Millhaven look, in the early gray morning light, like a thing newly made. Hester stood at her boarding house window and watched the snow and felt something that was not happiness exactly but was adjacent to it and moving in that direction, the way a compass needle settles. She had baked through the night before Christmas Eve, not for the platform, which would be quiet over the holiday, but for the town, for Ellen Abernathy's table, for the minister's family, and for a large order of pies that she had promised to deliver to the Finley ranch, because she had discovered that the cook's broken wrist was healing slowly, and that 8 ranch hands and 1 rancher had been living on camp beans and day-old biscuits for going on 6 weeks. David came to collect the pies himself, arriving at Ellen's kitchen door in the early morning snow with a wool scarf wrapped at his throat and his hat dusted white, and Ellen Abernathy admitted him with the expression of a woman who has been expecting someone and is satisfied with the timing. He carried the crates to his wagon, which was loaded with supplies for the ranch and sat in the street outside, and when the last crate was loaded, he turned back to her, where she stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat over her arm, and he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has composed his words in advance but is saying them now without the notes, "Come and see the ranch." She looked at him standing in the snow outside Ellen Abernathy's kitchen door with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains behind him turning pink in the first light, and thought about all the things she had learned about him over 10 weeks of depot platform mornings, and thought about Thomas, briefly and honestly and with love rather than guilt, and said, "When?" "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll bring the sleigh." He did. Christmas morning, before the snow had melted from the pine branches, he pulled up to Ellen Abernathy's boarding house in a low open sleigh drawn by the 2 bay horses, their breath pluming white in the cold air, and he helped Hester up onto the seat and spread a heavy wool blanket across both their laps, and they drove north through the white and silent morning with the mountains on their left and the frozen creek on their right and the whole world holding very still around them. The ranch was everything he had described and more. The stone building sat in a wide bend of the river, low and solid and well-built, with smoke rising from 2 chimneys and a snow-covered yard between the main house and the barn. The horses in the paddock stood with their backs to the wind and their heads down, dark shapes against the white, and a large dog of indeterminate breed came out to meet the sleigh with the enthusiasm of an animal whose social life is improved by any visitor. Aurelio Vega met them at the barn and took the horses with a brief word and a nod to Hester that carried a respect she found she appreciated. The ranch hands, most of them, were visible around the yard and the bunkhouse, and they looked at her with the frank curiosity of men who understood perfectly well why she was there, and approved of it without making a performance of their approval. The main house was warm, heated by a large stone fireplace in the main room and a cook stove in the kitchen, and it was simpler than Hester had imagined but not bare. There were books on the shelves beside the fireplace, and a good rug on the floor and a pair of oil lamps on the mantel, and the furniture was solid and plain and spoke of a man who valued function, but was not indifferent to comfort. He showed her the house with a quietness that she understood was a kind of vulnerability, the vulnerability of showing someone a thing you have built and cared about and are now holding out for their assessment. She walked through it and looked at everything honestly, the kitchen with its good stove and generous workspace, the 2 bedrooms and the small room that currently held a desk and surveying equipment and a great deal of rope, the back porch looking out over the river and the cottonwood grove. "It's a good house," she said, and she meant it the way she meant all her statements completely. "It needs things," he said. "I know that." "It needs a woman who knows how to make it what it could be," she said, and looked at him steadily. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Hester." "David," she said. The snow outside was very quiet. The river moved under its shelf of ice with a sound just barely audible through the back porch window, a low, continuous murmur like a conversation that had been going on for a very long time. "I am not a man who is good at eloquence," he said, which was honest because she had noticed this and found it entirely appealing, eloquence being frequently the companion of insincerity in her experience. "But I am a man who knows his own mind, and I have known mine for several weeks now. If you are of a similar mind, or if you think you might be, I would like to court you properly, with your full knowledge of what I'm hoping it might lead to." She had been widowed 14 months. She had sold her land and her past and moved to a boarding house and rebuilt her livelihood from nothing and made herself into a woman who was not waiting to be rescued from anything. She had arrived at the place she currently occupied by the force of her own will and her own labor, and she was offering herself to no one from need. "I am of a similar mind," she said, "and I appreciate that you asked." He crossed the porch to where she stood and looked down at her, and then took her hand very carefully, as though it were something he intended to hold for a long time and wanted to begin correctly, and she looked up at him and felt the flame that had been catching since that first October morning steady itself into a proper light. He did not kiss her. It was too soon for that, and they were both people who believed in doing things properly. But he held her hand and they stood at the back porch window looking out at the snow and the frozen river and the mountains beyond, and the silence between them was not empty but full, the specific fullness of 2 people who have found each other and know it. January came in hard and bright and cold, with the sky the deep winter blue that only the high altitude produced, a blue so saturated it seemed almost to ring. Hester opened her bakery on the 5th of January, 1883, in the small building on Main Street that had been the tobacco shop, with a sign painted by the schoolteacher's husband that read Chandler's Bakery in neat block letters. And Ellen Abernathy was there at opening with 3 of her boarders, and the minister's wife, and a small crowd of curious townspeople who had heard about the pies from the depot platform, and were interested to discover what a proper bakery could produce. The bread was the revelation. Hester had always known her bread was good, but baking it in a proper oven on a proper scale, with the good flour she could now afford to buy in quantity, produced something that the town responded to with a gratitude that had an almost desperate quality, the gratitude of people who had been eating inadequate substitutes for years and had not quite allowed themselves to know how much they missed the real thing. By the end of the first week, she was baking through 2 nights out of 3. By the end of the month, she had hired a girl named Priscilla Marsh, who was 17 and the daughter of a railroad carpenter, and who turned out to have both the aptitude and the willingness to learn everything Hester could teach her, which was considerable. David came to the bakery now as well as the depot platform, appearing in the early mornings before the main trading day began, and they developed the habit of sitting at the small table she kept near the front window for customers who wanted to eat their pie or bread there and then, and drinking coffee from the blue enamel pot she kept on the back of the stove, and talking. They talked about everything. They talked about the territory, which was changing rapidly under the pressure of the railway and the cattle trade, and the increasing pressure from Washington to resolve the land grant disputes that had been generating conflict in the region for years. They talked about the Lincoln County War, which was several years past but whose consequences still ran through the political and social fabric of the area like a seam of bad rock, about the questions of land ownership and legitimacy, and the competing claims of old Spanish land grants and new Anglo settlement that were still, in 1883, unresolved and generating bad blood. David spoke about these things with the measured concern of a man who owned land under clear title and knew it, and was therefore not personally threatened, but understood clearly the injustice being done to those who were. He had lost a friend in the Lincoln County troubles, a rancher who had been caught between factions through no particular partisanship of his own, and the loss had given him a specific and personal understanding of what it meant when legitimate legal processes were corrupted by money and political influence. She told him about the condition of the homesteaders she had known, families who had come west with genuine intention and legitimate claims, and found themselves trapped between the competing interests of the big land syndicates and the cattle operations, unable to hold their claims against pressure that was legal in form and corrupt in substance. She spoke about this without anger, but with the clear-eyed accuracy of a woman who had seen it firsthand and was not interested in pretending it was other than it was. He listened and he agreed, and this, more than any number of pleasant conversations about pie, confirmed what she had been discovering about him, that he was a man who could hold a complex truth without needing to simplify it in his own favor. The courtship had a formal dimension that Millhaven observed with the interest of a community that had limited entertainment in the winter months. David called on Hester at the bakery every morning and at Ellen Abernathy's on Sunday evenings, where they sat in Ellen's parlor under Ellen's quietly watchful eye and talked for several hours. And occasionally David read aloud from the newspaper or from one of the novels Ellen kept on her parlor shelves, because it turned out that he read well, and that listening to him read was one of the most comfortable things Hester had ever experienced. There were other aspects of the winter that were less comfortable. The weather was occasionally severe in ways that complicated both her baking schedule and his ranch work. A blizzard in late January that kept the roads closed for 4 days and made him worry about his cattle, and made her worry about him in a way that she acknowledged quietly to herself and said nothing about to Ellen, who was watching with sufficient attention without being supplied with additional evidence. His cook, whose wrist healed by mid-January, turned out to be a man named Percy Halloran, who had been cooking for cattle outfits since before the war, and who regarded the pies from Chandler's bakery with a professional respect that slightly surprised Hester when David told her about it. Percy apparently considered the sweet potato pie a masterwork of technical execution and had been studying the crust structure for weeks. David had described Hester's process to him in the detail he could recall, and Percy had been attempting to replicate it with only partial success. "Tell him the lard has to be cold," she said. "Very cold, almost frozen. That's the secret." "I'll tell him," David said, and then, with the near amusement at his own mouth, "though I suspect it will improve the ranch cooking to a point where my excuse for the Thursday ride to town becomes less plausible." "Your Thursday ride to town has nothing to do with the pies," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." February brought a thaw and then a cold snap, and then On the 14th, a day so mild it seemed to carry spring inside it the way a letter carries news. A day of blue sky and running water, and the smell of wet earth from the fields east of town. David appeared at the bakery that morning earlier than usual, before Priscilla Marsh had arrived, and while the bread was still in its second rise, and the bakery was warm and smelled of yeast and brown sugar, and the coffee she had just made. He was not nervous in any visible way. He sat down at the small table and took off his hat and said, without preamble, "I would like to marry you, Hester." She stood at the work counter with her hands dusted with flour and looked at him, and she thought about everything she knew about him, which was considerable by now, and about everything she had become since Thomas died, which was also considerable, and she said, "I would like that." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small ring, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone set in simple silver, the kind of ring made by the craftsmen in the territories, not the ostentatious jewelry of Eastern catalog houses, but something that belonged to the specific earth of this place. "It was made here," he said. "I thought that seemed right." She held out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit, which she took as confirmation of the rightness of everything. They were married on the 14th of March, 1883, in the small stone church at the north end of Millhaven's Main Street, by the minister whose wife had been Hester's first customer at the bakery, and who performed the ceremony with a warmth that was personal rather than merely professional. Ellen Abernathy sat in the front pew with a handkerchief she claimed was for a minor head cold and used extensively. Aurelio Vega came in from the ranch in his good clothes and stood up for David with a quiet dignity that Hester found moving. Priscilla Marsh was Hester's attendant, proud and slightly overwhelmed, wearing a new ribbon in her hair that Hester had bought from the dry goods store as a wedding gift. The wedding supper was held at Mrs. Abernathy's, because Ellen had insisted on it as her contribution to the occasion, and she had cooked for 2 days in preparation, and the table was covered with the full range of her considerable repertoire, and the ranch hands came in from the Finley spread in their cleanest shirts, and ate with the gratitude of men for whom a home-cooked celebration supper was a rare and cherished thing. Aurelio Vega made a toast in Spanish, and someone translated it for those who could not follow, and it was about good land and good people finding each other, and Hester thought it was exactly right. She moved to the ranch the following week, taking her grandmother's recipe book and her mother's garnet earrings and the blue enamel coffee pot, and the set of skills she had built over 14 months of survival, and she kept the bakery, because it was hers and it was profitable, and because she was not a woman who abandoned things she had built, and because Priscilla Marsh was by now entirely capable of managing the day-to-day operation under Hester's direction and visits, which she made twice weekly on market days. The ranch in spring was a different thing than the ranch in winter, alive with the green that came up along the river bends when the snow melt came down from the mountains, and the cottonwoods put out their first thin leaves, and the meadowlarks came back and filled the mornings with their unreasonable optimism. Hester learned the ranch's rhythms the way she had learned everything, by observation and attention, and she found that the rhythms suited her in a way the homestead's lonely rhythms had not, because these rhythms included David, always, morning and evening and through the middle of the day, a presence as steadying and reliable as the mountains. She learned his habits. He rose before light and walked out to the barn before breakfast, not from necessity but from preference, a man who needed the first quiet hour of the day outdoors to set himself right. He came back in for breakfast with the smell of hay and horse on his coat, and ate with the complete appetite of a man who had already been at work for an hour, and they talked over breakfast in the easy way of people who have found that conversation requires no effort between them. In the evenings he read, sitting in the chair by the fireplace with the dog at his feet, and she sat across from him with her mending or her accounts, and the lamplight was warm and the fire was good, and the house was exactly what she had said it needed, not in the sense of decoration and curtains and polish, though she had attended to those things as well, but in the deeper sense of two people moving through the same space with mutual ease. She planted a kitchen garden in April, turning over a plot south of the house where the soil was deep and well-drained, and David helped her break the ground on a Sunday afternoon, working alongside her with a spade while she worked with a fork, and they talked and did not talk in equal measure. And when they stopped for water at midday and stood looking at the turned earth, he said, "My mother would have liked you." "Because of the garden?" she asked. "Because of everything," he said. "But the garden is a good reason too." She stood her fork in the earth and looked at him. This man she had married 2 weeks ago and had been building toward since that first October morning, when she had stood at her pie table and felt something catching. She thought about how much had changed in the 6 months since she had arrived at Millhaven Depot with her 2 flat crates and her grandmother's recipes, and how the change did not feel like the ending of one thing and the beginning of another, but like a continuous movement, a river finding the open ground. "Your mother would have liked you too," she said. "I think she would have been very proud." Spring deepened into summer, and the ranch work intensified in the way of cattle country in the warm months, with the gather and the branding and the long days in the saddle that David and his hands put in from before light to after dark. Hester ran the house and the garden and made the twice-weekly trips to the bakery in Millhaven, driving the small buggy that David had bought for her because the mule cart she had been using was beneath the standard he considered appropriate for his wife, which made her argue with him briefly, and then accept the buggy because it was faster, and the horse was genuinely better tempered than any mule she had ever known. The bakery thrived through the summer, serving the increased traffic that the warm season brought through Millhaven, and she began, cautiously, to take on custom orders, cakes for weddings and celebrations, bread orders for the hotels, a standing arrangement with the railroad company to supply rolls for the dining car that ran the section between Albuquerque and Raton. The standing railroad order required her to expand, and she hired a second girl, a young woman named Josephine Reyes, who was 20 years old and came from a family that had been in the territory since the Spanish land grant era, and who regarded the newcomers who had displaced so much of that history with a wariness that Hester respected and did not try to overcome by mere friendliness. Josephine was the better baker of the 2 hired girls within 3 months, which Hester told her directly, and which produced, in Josephine, the first genuine warmth she had shown toward her employer. "My grandmother would have said you were wasting your time with these people," Josephine told her one morning, rolling bread dough with the efficient speed she brought to everything. She didn't think Anglos could be trusted. "She wasn't wrong to be careful," Hester said, measuring flour. "A great deal of trust has been broken." Josephine looked at her steadily. "You know about the land grants?" "I know some," Hester said. "My husband knows more. He's been watching what the Maxwell Land Grant Company has been doing for years, and he doesn't think much of it." "My family had land north of here," Josephine said, "before the grant companies started pushing." "I'm sorry," Hester said, and she meant it as she meant everything completely. They did not resolve the history of the territory in the kitchen of Chandler's bakery, because history is not resolved in individual kitchens however honest the conversation. But they understood each other, and the understanding produced a working relationship that was genuine and respectful, and Josephine became, over time, more than an employee and something like a friend. September brought with it the particular golden quality that the territory possessed in the fall, the light thickening and sweetening and the high meadows turning to amber, and the smell of wood smoke from the ranch hands' fires in the evenings, and Hester standing at the kitchen door of the ranch house looking at the last light on the mountains with a cup of coffee in her hands and David's arm around her shoulders, felt something that she could only describe as complete. She was fairly certain, expecting a child. She had not said anything yet, because she was a woman who was careful about announcements before they were confirmed facts. But her body, which she understood with the thorough practicality she brought to everything, was telling her something with increasing insistence, and the signs were not ambiguous. She told David on a Tuesday evening in late September after supper, when the light was almost gone, and the fireplace was lit for the first time since spring and the dog was in his usual position in front of it. She told him simply and directly, watching his face, and she saw the careful control he always kept slip for just a moment, replaced by something so open and undefended that it made her chest ache in the best way, something that was pure astonished joy. He crossed the room to where she sat and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment as though she were something he was seeing clearly for the first time. "Hester," he said, which was all he said and which was entirely sufficient. "Sometime in April, I think," she said. He sat down beside her and took her hands and held them and said nothing, and the fire crackled and the dog shifted and the night came down outside, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the steady, reliable beat of his heart, which had become in 6 months of marriage the most familiar sound in her world. Ellen Abernathy received the news with a satisfaction so profound it verged on triumph, as though she had personally arranged the entire sequence of events, which Hester sometimes suspected was not entirely inaccurate. Aurelio Vega shook David's hand with a wordless dignity that carried more warmth than a speech. Percy Halloran cooked an inexplicably elaborate supper with no announcement of any kind, leaving it on the kitchen table with a note that said only congratulations, and retreated to the bunkhouse before anyone could comment on it. The ranch hands, collectively, began to treat Hester with an additional layer of protectiveness that she found touching and occasionally exasperating in equal measure. The pregnancy was uneventful in the way that good health and good care produce, though the territory's isolation meant that the nearest doctor of any competence was in Millhaven, and Hester was already acquainted with the doctor there, a young man named Marcus Webb who had come west from Philadelphia 2 years prior, and who had been a regular customer of her apple pie since the depot platform days. She drove in to see him monthly through the fall and winter, and he confirmed that everything was proceeding well, and she returned from each visit with bread from the bakery and the comfortable feeling of a woman whose life is where she intended it to be. Winter came again, the second winter of her widowhood being entirely unlike the first, the cold now a thing she experienced from inside warmth and security rather than from inside fear. She baked on the ranch stove on the days when the roads were closed, supplying the ranch hands with bread and pies that they received with an enthusiasm that Percy Halloran regarded from the bunkhouse with a slightly competitive regard. She had the conversations with David that the long winter evenings produced, conversations that ranged over everything, over plans for the ranch and the bakery, over the news that came in from the outside world by train and telegraph, over books and weather, and the particular quality of the night sky over the San Antonio River Valley, which she had come to love with a specificity that surprised her. The territory was changing around them, as it had been changing since the railway arrived, as it would continue to change under the pressure of statehood movements and land grant litigation, and the gradual end of the open range. David watched these changes with the careful attention of a man whose livelihood was connected to them, and whose sense of justice was occasionally at odds with the direction of progress. And they talked about this, about what the future of the territory was likely to look like, and what it should look like, and how far those two things diverged. She had begun to understand that what she loved about him, among the many things she loved about him, was that he was never comfortable with easy answers, never willing to pretend that the world was simpler than it was, and that this same quality in her, which she had always slightly suspected might be a defect, the inability to accept the convenient over the true, was instead a foundation for the kind of partnership she had not known was possible before she found it. James David Finley arrived on the 7th of April, 1884, in the stone bedroom of the Finley Ranch house on the San Antonio River, after a labor that was not easy but was also not catastrophic, attended by Dr. Webb, who drove out from Millhaven in the pre-dawn dark, and by a woman named Clara Reyes, Josephine's mother, who had brought 4 children of her own into the world and who understood what was needed before being asked, and provided it with a calm efficiency that Hester deeply appreciated. David was in the outer room for most of it, which was the convention, but Hester could hear him through the door, not speaking, just present, and the knowledge of his presence was more steadying than anything else. When Dr. Webb came out to tell him that his wife and son were well, Hester heard a sound from the outer room that she recognized, years later, as the sound of a man who has been holding himself together through sheer force of will allowing himself to stop. She asked to see him immediately, and he came in with his composure restored but his eyes entirely undefended, and she held the baby out to him, this small, red-faced creature who had arrived in the world with considerable opinion about it. And David took him with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything important, and looked at him for a long time without speaking. "James," he said finally, which was what they had agreed on for his grandfather on his mother's side. "Hello, James." James David Finley regarded his father with the blank ancient regard of new babies, and then, with an impeccable sense of timing, went to sleep. The summer of 1884 was the best summer Hester could remember, which was saying something, because she had good summers to compare it to. The baby grew and became curious, and then mobile and then vocal, in roughly that order, at a pace that delighted everyone at the ranch, and occasionally alarmed Percy Halloran, when James began to investigate the kitchen with the thoroughness of someone planning a survey. The ranch flourished, the cattle prices holding well, the river providing good water through a summer that was drier than usual, David's careful management of the grazing land paying dividends in ways that lesser operators on poorer land did not experience. The bakery flourished also, under Priscilla and Josephine's capable management, with Hester driving in 3 days a week now rather than 5, and spending those days partly in the bakery, and partly attending to the administrative side of the business that she had discovered required more time than she had initially estimated. She had a small desk in the back room of the bakery where she kept her accounts and her supply orders and her correspondence, and she sat at this desk on Thursday mornings after the morning rush, and worked through the numbers with the same careful pleasure she had always taken in making the arithmetic come out right. By the autumn of 1884, Chandler's Bakery was employing 4 people, supplying the railroad dining car on a regular contract, providing the general store with daily bread, and turning a profit that surprised even Hester, who had always believed in it. The name over the door was still Chandler's, which David had accepted without comment because he understood, as she did, that the business was hers and had grown from her own history, and that changing the name would have required changing something else as well, something that should not be changed. James walked at 11 months and ran at 13, with a reckless confidence that came from some combination of his father's certainty and his mother's determination, and the ranch hands watched him with the proprietary pride of men who had known him since birth and considered themselves collectively responsible for his development. Aurelio Vega taught him the names of the horses before he could string 3 English words together, and it was generally agreed that this was an appropriate order of priorities given the world into which he had been born. The October of 1884, 2 full years after Hester had stood at her pie table at the Millhaven depot and watched a stranger in a brown wool coat approach from the end of the platform, was a month of particular beauty, the aspens along the river gone to gold, and the sky so clear it seemed impossible, and the afternoons warm enough still to sit outside on the back porch in the later light, with the baby asleep in the house and the sound of the river, and the far sound of the cattle from the northern pastures, and the smell of the turning season. They sat there on a Sunday afternoon late in the month, Hester with her mending and David with the newspaper from last Thursday's train, and the dog in his usual location, which was wherever David was, and the mountains to the north holding the last of the light on their upper slopes. 2 years ago this month, Hester said, not looking up from her mending. 3rd Saturday, he said, also not looking up from his newspaper. You had 16 pies and I bought the lot. She looked up then. You remember the count? I remember everything about that morning, he said, and he put the newspaper down and looked at her with the direct gray-green gaze that she had never quite stopped noticing. Even now, even after 2 years and a marriage and a child, and the accumulated weight of 200 mornings of breakfast together, and 200 evenings of lamplight and firelight, and the ordinary extraordinary texture of a shared life. You had a calico bonnet that was fraying at the brim, and you made change with a tin box from your apron pocket, and you looked at me like you were trying to decide whether I was trustworthy. I was, she said. I know, he said, and I was on my best behavior because of it. She laughed. You bought every last pie and asked my name. That was your best behavior. I didn't ask your name until after the transaction, he said. I thought that was respectful. It was, she said, still smiling, and looked at the mountains. I had $43 in a tin box under the kitchen floorboards. I know, he said. You told me. I had nothing else, she said, only the recipes and the stove. You had more than that, he said. You had more than you knew. She looked at him. The light was going from the mountains, and the air was cooling rapidly in the way of desert country, and the back porch was becoming less viable for sitting. And in the house, the baby would soon be awake from his afternoon sleep, and the evening would fill with the noise and movement and delight of a 14-month-old, in possession of his freedom and his opinion. There was supper to make and a ranch to run and a business to manage and 100 ordinary things to do, and all of it was exactly what she had asked for when she had loaded her 2 flat crates and driven the mule cart 4 miles in the pre-dawn cold to set up a table at the Millhaven depot. I know that now, she said. He reached across and took her hand, the one with the turquoise ring on it, and held it with the same care with which he had taken it the first time, as though it were something he intended to hold for a very long time. Good, he said. The baby's voice came from inside the house, not crying, only announcing his condition, the imperious and cheerful announcement of a child who has woken from sleep and wishes the world to be aware of it. They both heard it and looked at each other, and Hester stood, and David stood, and they went inside together through the back porch door, into the warmth and light and noise of the life they had made. Spring came again as it always does, regardless of human happiness or misery, with the same impartiality it had always brought, the same run of cold, wet days and warm, clear days, and the same smell of wet sage and new grass. James was 2, and had developed a theory about the proper way to feed the chickens that differed substantially from the actual proper way, but which he pursued with unshakable conviction. The ranch hands thought this was the funniest thing they had witnessed in years, which was not entirely helpful. The bakery had, by the spring of 1885, become what Hester had imagined from the beginning, a genuine institution of the town. There were now 2 rooms, the front where customers came and the back where the baking happened, and a small side room that Priscilla Marsh had requisitioned for the storage of the prodigious quantities of flour and sugar and lard that the operation now consumed. Josephine Reyes had been made a partner in a quiet ceremony at the small desk in the back room, Hester having determined that the business could not have reached its current scale without Josephine's contribution, and that this should be reflected in more than a wage. Josephine had received the offer with characteristic stillness and then said, with a formality that Hester recognized as the expression of something deeply felt, "My grandmother would have said you were an unusual woman." "I'm not sure if that's a compliment," Hester said. "It is," Josephine said. "Coming from her, it is absolutely a compliment." Ellen Abernathy remained a constant, appearing at the ranch for Sunday supper with a regularity that David accepted with complete goodwill, having recognized early that Ellen was a woman whose presence improved any room she occupied, and whose opinion of him was worth having. Ellen and James had formed an alliance of mutual esteem that operated outside the normal authority structures of the household and produced, on several occasions, small conspiracies of a broadly pyrrelated nature. The autumn of 1885 brought a second pregnancy, announced with the same directness as the first, and David received it with the same open, astonished joy, slightly better controlled this time, as practice had given him some preparation, and the ranch and the town and the household prepared again for a new arrival in the spring. Aurelio Vega was the first to suggest, with the oblique delicacy he brought to all personal matters, that perhaps the ranch ought to have a proper room designated for children, since the current arrangement of James sleeping in the small room that had been David's office, surrounded by surveying equipment and rope, was becoming logistically complicated. David looked around the house with the eyes of a man seeing it newly and agreed that an expansion was warranted, and by December he and his hands had framed out a new wing at the back, 2 proper bedrooms and a shared sitting room between them, built from the same stone as the rest of the house, solid and straight and made to last. The cold months of that winter were the busiest Hester had known, managing the bakery at partial remove, while the pregnancy advanced, directing Priscilla and Josephine from the ranch on the days she could not drive in, working with Percy Halloran on the ranch kitchen on the days when the weather was too severe for travel, and occupying herself through the long evenings with the small detailed work of preparing for a new life. The sewing and the planning and the quiet particular pleasure of a house that was already a home being made ready to expand. David read to her in the evenings, sitting with the book close to the lamp and the dog in his place and James asleep in the new room that smelled of fresh plaster and pine, and she listened with her hands still in her lap, and the fire burning low, and the mountains out of sight in the winter dark, held there by her knowledge of where they were. Margaret Ellen Finley arrived on the 14th of April, 1886, precisely 9 days after her due date, which Hester had by then decided was a character statement rather than an accident. She was dark-haired like her mother and possessed from the first of a quality of attention that Dr. Webb, who had driven out again in the early morning, described as unusually focused for a newborn. James received his sister with an expression of profound assessment, concluded that she was acceptable, and attempted to share with her a piece of biscuit, which was gently redirected. The ranch in the spring of 1886 was a going concern in every sense, the cattle operation healthy, and expanding slowly in the controlled way that David preferred, the buildings all in good repair, the kitchen garden that Hester had planted 3 years earlier now producing in abundance, and the household running with the particular efficiency of a place where everyone knows their role and performs it well. The world outside was continuing to change. The territory moved toward statehood with the grinding slowness of political process. The land grant disputes continued to generate conflict and injustice, and David had twice signed his name to petitions against the methods of the largest land syndicates, which had caused brief awkwardness with some of his business associates and which he declined to regret. Hester had written letters to the Millhaven Gazette on 2 occasions, letters signed with her full name, regarding the condition of the Spanish land grant families being dispossessed by legal maneuvers that were corrupt in substance if not in form, and these letters had generated both approval and criticism, the latter coming primarily from men who benefited from the status quo and the former from everyone else. Josephine Reyes had read both letters in the bakery and said nothing immediately. Then, the following morning, she had arrived with a pan of traditional bread she had made at home, set it on the counter of Chandler's bakery and said, "My grandmother's recipe. I'd like to sell it here if you're agreeable." "I'm agreeable," Hester said. The bread sold out within a day, and then twice as much the following week, and it became a fixture of the bakery's regular production, listed on the small slate board in the front room simply by its name, and it was one of the best decisions either of them ever made. By the summer of 1887, Chandler's Bakery had outgrown its space on Main Street, and Hester had contracted with the carpenter to expand into the adjacent building, which the retired schoolteacher had vacated. The expansion took 3 months and cost more than she had planned for, as such things always do. But the result was a bakery that could properly serve a town that had grown considerably from the small railroad stop it had been when she first set up her crates on the depot platform 5 years prior. She stood outside the finished expansion on a late summer afternoon and looked at the sign that now stretched across the full width of 2 storefronts, Chandler's Bakery, and felt the solid satisfaction of a thing completed. David appeared beside her, having driven in from the ranch on the pretext of collecting supplies, and stood looking at the sign with the expression she knew meant he was genuinely moved but was not going to make a production of it. "It's a proper establishment," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Your grandmother would have been astonished," he said. "She would have understood every bit of it," Hester said. "She's the one who taught me." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the familiar ease of 3.5 years of marriage. And the main street of Millhaven moved around them in the busy, ordinary way of a Thursday afternoon, the horses at the rail, and the women with their baskets and the men in conversation outside the general store, and the smell of the bakery behind them warm and sweet on the late summer air. James, who was 3 and had been given the temporary care of his father during this expedition to town, escaped from David's hand at that moment, demonstrating the speed and single-mindedness that characterized his approach to all opportunities, and made directly for the bakery door, which he could now reach the handle of, and went inside, where Josephine caught him with the resigned competence of someone who had been catching this specific child for the majority of his ambulatory life. David watched this through the glass and exhaled. "He is entirely your son," he said. "He has your determination," she said. "Redirected," he said. She laughed and took his hand, and they went inside. The following October, 5 years to the month from the morning Hester had stood at the Millhaven depot with her 2 flat crates and watched a stranger approach from the end of the platform. She drove into town for the Thursday market day with James beside her on the buggy seat, chattering about the horses with the specificity of a child who had been raised among them, and Margaret asleep in the bassinet, wedged carefully behind them, and the mountain air cold and clean and brilliant. She set up her table on the depot platform, which she had never abandoned, in the same corner under the overhang of the freight office roof, and arranged the pies with the same care she had always brought to it, and served the morning crowd of cattle buyers and cowboys and drummers and landmen, and made change with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years, and talked pleasantly with her regular customers, and watched the trains come and go. Andrej Havel, the station master, who had let her use this corner in exchange for 2 pies a week, and whose twin boys were now 5 years old, stopped by at mid-morning as he always did. "Good morning, Mrs. Finley," he said. "Sweet potato today, sweet potato and apple and chess," she said, "and a new one dried apricot. Tell me what you think." He took a slice of the apricot with the solemn seriousness of a man who took his responsibilities as a pie taster seriously, ate it, and nodded. "That one," he said, "will be very popular." "I thought so," she said. David arrived at 9:30, on horseback, the big bay he had been riding for 4 years now, and tied up at the rail, and walked to her table with his hat in his hand, and looked at the pies, and then looked at her. And she looked at him. And 5 years of everything that had happened between them was in that look, all of it. The first October morning, and the Christmas social, and the porch in the snow, and the ring, and the vows, and James and Margaret, and the kitchen garden, and the stone house, and the mountains going pink at sunset, and all the evenings of firelight, and all the mornings of coffee and conversation, all of it present and accounted for, all of it real. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "Slice or quarter?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Have you got any sweet potato left?" "Last one," she said, and cut him a generous piece and wrapped it carefully in brown paper and handed it to him, and their fingers touched across the table in the way they had 100 times and which still, she was aware, produced the same small warmth that she had felt the first time. He ate his pie leaning against the freight office wall in the manner of a man who had discovered this to be the ideal position for the consumption of depot platform pie 5 years ago, and saw no reason to revise this judgment. And she served her customers and kept her accounts and watched James, who had been permitted to walk the platform under the strict supervision of the freight office assistant, an obliging young man named Thomas, who had not yet learned to appreciate what this supervision would actually require. When the morning rush had settled and the crowd had thinned toward noon, David came back to her table and stood there in the familiar way, and they talked about the ranch and the bakery and the week's news from the papers and James's latest development, which was the conviction that he could train the working dogs to perform functions they had no interest in performing, and about Margaret's recent discovery of her own hands, which she was regarding with an interest that they both found unreasonably endearing. And they talked about the future, as they always did, because they were people who had learned that the future required attention and intention, and the willingness to make plans and then revise them as the land required, and because the territory was becoming something new and they were part of what it was becoming. With the bakery and the ranch and the names over both and the children, who would grow up in the stone house by the river with the mountains to the north, and the sound of the trains through Millhaven, and the smell of good bread in the morning. Priscilla Marsh was engaged to be married to the young schoolteacher's assistant, and Hester had already begun to think about what the bakery would look like when it was time to promote Josephine and find someone new to train, the way one thinks about the future in a place where the future is genuinely being made, not just awaited. Aurelio Vega had told them the previous month that he intended to retire within 3 years, which was the first mention he had ever made of his own future, and David had spent a week processing this information with the quiet intensity he brought to important things, and had then sat down with Aurelio and discussed it properly. And the result was an arrangement that suited both of them and which included, among other provisions, a small house on the river bend that would be built to Aurelio's specifications, because a man who had given his working life to a place had the right to stay in it on his own terms. The afternoon train came in at 1 o'clock, and the platform filled briefly and then emptied, and Hester began to pack her remaining pies, the 3 she had set aside for Ellen Abernathy's household, and the special order for the hotel dining room, and the pair she was bringing home for supper. James had been retrieved from his supervision arrangement, and was sitting on one of the shipping crates eating a slice of apple pie with the concentration of a person engaged in serious work. David helped her load the crates, as he always did, shifting them to the easier angle without being asked, and she watched his hands, still broad and scarred and careful, and thought about the first morning she had noticed them, this quality of carefulness, and how she had recognized it then as something trustworthy without yet knowing the full measure of what it meant. She climbed up onto the buggy seat, and he handed James up to sit beside her and then stood at the wheel, and looked up at her with the gray-green eyes that she had identified correctly from 20 feet away on a cold October morning 5 years ago as belonging to a man who was watching with something focused and considering, a man working through a careful calculation that had turned out to be entirely mutual. "I'll be home by 4, he said. "Supper at 6, she said. "I'm making the pot roast." "Percy will be grateful," he said. "He's been angling for pot roast for a week. Percy has told me," she said, 3 times very subtly. "He thinks he's subtle," David said. "He is not," she said. James chose this moment to announce that he was finished with his pie and was ready to go home and see the horses, in that order, and the announcement was sufficiently loud that two men at the far end of the platform turned to look, and Andrej Havel laughed from inside the freight office. David reached up and put his hand briefly over hers on the reins and looked at her, and what she saw in his face was what she had been seeing for 5 years, the steady, undefended openness of a man who had found what he was looking for and knew it and was not embarrassed to have it known. "Go on then," he said. "I'll see you at home." She clucked to the horse and the buggy pulled forward, and she drove away from the depot platform in the bright October afternoon with her son beside her and her daughter asleep behind her, and the mountains on the horizon and the smell of the territory in the air, and the road north ahead of her, leading to the stone house by the river that was exactly what she had asked for and more than she had known to hope. She did not look back at the platform, because she did not need to. She knew what was there. She knew who would be riding up that road behind her within the hour, and who would come through the kitchen door at 4:30 smelling of hay and horse and the clean outdoor cold, and who would sit across the supper table from her in the lamplight and hold her hand across it after the dishes were done, and who would be there in the morning when the light came over the mountains and the day began again. She had arrived here through the arithmetic of survival and the courage that looks, from the inside, exactly like the absence of any other option. She had built a table at a depot platform and sold pies, and held herself together with the recipes her grandmother had given her, and the stubbornness her mother had given her, and the land sense that the territory itself had given her. And from all of that, from nothing that resembled ease, she had made a life that was full and real and hers. James leaned against her arm, sleepy from the fresh air and the apple pie, and she shifted the reins to her other hand and put her arm around him, and the buggy rolled north through the golden afternoon, and the cottonwoods along the creek were all gold and the sky above them was that deep October blue, and the mountains held the light the way they always did, patient and permanent and entirely themselves. Everything was accounted for. Everything was whole. The story that had begun on a cold October morning at a depot platform with 2 flat crates and 16 pies, and a widow with $43 in a tin box, and a stranger who asked her name, had arrived at exactly the place it was supposed to. And it was, by any honest measure, a very good place to be.